Hello, everyone. Welcome to Awaken Your Soul's Journey, How to Overcome Grief Through Healing. And I am Angela Clement and the host. I am so delighted to have with me here today, Covey. He is a leader in wellness and he supports internationally as a trainer, a speaker, and a group facilitator, and probably a lot of other things that I'll let him talk about. I know he's trained in a lot of modalities. So welcome, Chris.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm really happy to be here.
Wonderful. So I thought maybe you could just give us a little bit of background, what it is you do.
Well, what I do now, I should probably talk about it in a transitional way because I have just recently left my role as being the director of wellness for Colorado State Patrol. So I've just spent the last few years working with state troopers and dispatchers and first responders. And so that's been a big part of my life. And it definitely plays into the conversation that we're going to have today. What I've transitioned into is working alongside my wife, Masami. We've been developing through her work and my work as well, courses and trainings and working with people individually around developing their own healing journey through particularly focusing on the intersection between physicality and spirituality. So how the physiology of their body can be supported to really promote their sense of meaning and connection in their lives.
Oh, wow. That sounds fascinating. Okay. So how would you define grief?
You know, grief there's so many ways to look at it. And in my personal experience, grief has had many descriptors. There are times where it has felt like a deep, dark well that I slipped down into and couldn't find where the bottom was until I hit. It has felt like a sudden shock where things that I thought I knew about myself and life were ripped away. Complete disorientation, sadness, just feeling turned inside out and helpless. There's so many things that grief does to us that are inconceivable from a cognitive standpoint. And for me, another facet that I hope we can touch on as we talk today is that grief is also very much a physiological stressor in the body. And I think for me, that's been one of the most important pieces in understanding, particularly the recovery side of it. So maybe I'll leave it there for now and grow the conversation as we go.
Yes, and I certainly, let's pick that back up because I'm fascinated with that. I also wanted to know, do you have I know there are some myths out there about grief. I know as a society, we don't talk about it a lot, but when we do, sometimes we get it wrong. Can you explain some of those kinds of things?
Well, one that has crept in more recently, and although I think it's been there, it's been prevalent at least in Western, if not North American culture in particular, is this idea that grief is a pathology, that there's something wrong with grieving, especially if we grieve too much. And that's something that it's such a personal thing. I think that that's one thing that is also important in this conversation is that grief is what, from my training and background and clinical practice, I would call a bio-individual response, meaning it's going to have a different look and feel and effect on every single person. There's no way that you could say this is what grief should be for you. And so if we're talking about myths, I think it's the idea that there is a just right time frame, like the magical 6 weeks that the DSM-5 prescribes, before you start getting diagnosed as having prolonged grief disorder. And this is something else that it creeps in with our bosses, with our friends, with our family members. And I think what it comes down to is this idea that, okay, it's time to get over it, or it's time to move on. It's time to go get some help. All right, we've had enough. Like you're making us uncomfortable. The time has passed now. And so I think that what we have to look at is it's bio-individual. it's also something that, whether we're conscious of it or not, it's a very socially regulated process. So it's happening internally for us on a personal level, but it's also happening externally from the people that see it. And they feel some effect from it as well. If I could just say a quick aside, I was just speaking with a friend yesterday who's originally from Italy. And he was telling me that when he was a kid, people still wore black armbands and little black lapel buttons, or like in Canada, or the UK with the poppies around Remembrance Day.
Yeah.
Those are all public signs of grief and mourning. We don't really use those for personal loss anymore, though. Even in Italy, it's more or less gone away. Maybe in some very traditional places, they still do that. But for the most part, it's regulated and moderated by external factors. And so we're kind of left with whatever we're feeling inside. And if it doesn't match up with other people and what they're telling us should be the case for us, we might just feel lost and broken and hopeless. So I think those are all things we have to watch for.
Yeah. And what comes to mind for me is that, people will say to you, well, you're doing really well. You're doing fantastic. Like, how can you, and then inside you're just dying. And people encourage that. They want you to be doing well. And so they use that to encourage.
That has absolutely been a big part of my experience, and also the unfortunate breakdown internally that happened as a result of trying to carry on that face. So that was a very damaging thing for me personally.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah. And I guess the other thing that I kind of struggled with at the beginning was just finding help, because I found that when I went to social media, there was a lot of groups on there that had similar stories as mine, but unfortunately, there was no tool to use or any advice. It was more sharing your story. And so I struggled for a bit trying to find that help.
Well, the story sharing is powerful. If for no other reason than it allows us to see that there are others that are having similar experiences.
Yes.
So, I mean, that just to take us out of the silo of our own life, our own thoughts, the feedback loop that we impose on ourselves.
Right.
It's very helpful to know that others are having their own version of that experience. We also have to recognize that it's not the same. And that's the hard part. That's where it gets slippery.
Right. Yeah. And just the fact that there's no timeline, you have no idea how long this is going to be, and everybody's different. And so, nobody can really help you with that. That's a tough part too. Yeah. So, what is your grief journey? What was your grief journey, and how did you get through it?
Yeah, well, the one I wanted to share is the event that most profoundly has shaped my life. And oftentimes when we talk about grief, we usually mean the loss of someone we have cared about and loved. And, ironically, that is what I'm talking about in a way. But for me, the real event that was so devastating was an injury that I experienced. So this now it's been almost, I can't believe it, it's coming up to 30 years. It happened when I was just about 18. I was living in Canada at the time, and I suffered a very severe high-speed mountain biking crash, where I crashed on my face and head. Fast forwarding through it, I didn't learn till years later that I had not only, of course, experienced a very severe traumatic brain injury, which they didn't even scan for at the time. I also found that I had a lot of other structural injuries, which were also missed when I finally made it to the hospital. And so for me, what happened? And so I talked about how, grief can be like, it's like something just gets ripped away. And I also just a minute ago mentioned that we think about it as the loss of somebody close or someone we love. Well, in my case, it was actually the self that I thought I was.
Mhm.
So I knew myself in this certain way, being a very active, pretty outgoing person, involved in a lot of sports and activities, really looking at, it's the last year of high school, secondary school. I had the world in my hands, it seemed like. And then this accident happened. And when it happened, um, all I wanted to do is play it down. Even the day of, I was still acting like everything was fine. I could see the horror on my friends' faces that I was with when I finally came back to consciousness, because they saw me get thrown off my bike and land and roll and all these things, and the crumpled heap that I was in at the end of that. And so when I came out of the unconscious, semi-conscious state and was able to actually speak again, I wanted to just brush myself off. I could tell something was wrong because one of my shoulders was stuck up like this. And I was saying, I could barely breathe. And I was just like, no, I'm okay. I pulled a muscle or something. I'm okay. I even rode my bicycle, which is mangled, back to the car the rest of the way with one hand. And even that day, they're like, well, should we go to the hospital? Should we take it? I'm like, no, I'm fine. I'll be okay. I even went home, took a shower. My whole face and everything was scraped up. Went to my girlfriend's house. We spent time over there. And when I finally came home later that evening, that's when I started to realize how seriously injured I was, because now it was really starting to hurt more and more. And by the next day, I couldn't even move. I could not even move my body without excruciating pain. And so by the time I went to the hospital, I was so inflamed, I couldn't even sit down. I had to stay standing because I couldn't move. And they ran all these tests, and ultimately I was so inflamed they couldn't see anything. So they ended up discharging me to my general practitioner. And so I largely went untreated. And the worst part was I had these external injuries, which were visible to everyone else. I had scrapes and bruises, and my face was a mess, black eye, everything. And that's what everybody else saw. And that was disturbing enough for people to look at that. But then as those external injuries started to heal, I knew how much I was still hurting. But when I would see other people, they'd say, oh, you're doing so much better. You look great. Oh, after that last horror show, when I saw you, you're looking really good. But I couldn't tell them, yes, but I can barely remember what you just said to me 5 seconds ago. I lost my short-term memory almost completely for months. I was in so much pain. I mean, it hurt just to move the slightest things for I would say several years after that, especially the first few months. And so, like we were talking about a few minutes ago, it was that experience of reacting to other people's expectations, where I could see, okay, it's making them uncomfortable for me to still be hurt and in pain. So I'm going to make it so they don't have to be uncomfortable. So I'll just pretend like I'm okay. Right. And I did. I did everything in my power, and I can tell you, it used up so much energy that I really didn't have. My body needed that energy to heal, and I was using it just to look normal.
Right.
So that was the setup for it. But what I didn't know was coming is that it had changed everything in my life. It had changed my personality. It changed my relationships with other people. It made it so I was very susceptible to chronic depression, very difficult to work through problem solving for a long time, or if I was in stress. My whole metabolism changed. It slowed way down. And I mentioned the pain, but probably one of the bigger pains was the shame I felt around feeling broken. And that's just something that I more or less accepted after the first couple of years. Things started to just take a slow downturn, and I just rode that down. And it's just like every year it felt a little worse, a little worse, a little worse. And I tell myself things like, oh, I guess I'm just getting older. This is not what I expected, but it's really too bad. But I think I must just be aging, and that's what it's like. People complain about it. I wasn't even thinking about all these things until I started doing grad school. I was working as a teacher. I was moving into an administrative role at the school, and I started to learn about traumatic brain injuries. And then the light started to go on, and I realized, wait a second, I had a massive traumatic brain injury.
Mm,
Life has not been the same since. Could
right.
this be connected? It's like it didn't even occur to me in all those years before that, when I was really suffering, that it wasn't just personality flaws. It wasn't just that I'm something is wrong with me. It was something severe and profound happened that changed everything. And that's the part that I'm still finding myself in relationship to that process.
Mm,
Still going.
right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, so there's some very similar things with grief that I could see running alongside that story, you know, and you're right, grief doesn't always have to be a loss of a person. It can absolutely be, a loss like what you have. So, what are some things that got you through that, or helping you move through that, I guess?
Yeah. So I would define the kind of grief that I have gone through as a loss of capacity or a loss of sense of self.
Mhm.
Um, and those have been very powerful factors. So for me, the hardest part was I did what many people do who are injured in some way, whether it's a spiritual or emotional or psychological injury, physical injury. We do what other animals do. We fold back into ourselves. And so the self-isolation, risk aversion, hiding away, protecting myself, those were all things that I began to do more and more and more. So it became harder for me to actually get help because I was cutting myself off from help. And so I would say that for me, one of the big turning points was when I met my wife, because she was the first person who really acknowledged what I was experiencing.
Mhm.
And not only that, she started to show me that there were things I could do, which I'd just given up on. I just figured it's a lost cause. And to be honest, I was dipping my toes in the suicidal waters during that time. It was a very dark period of time in my mid-20s in particular. And I just moved back to the United States from living overseas in Japan. And I didn't have any connections here. My family had kind of found their way back from Canada. They were living in Colorado again, but the disconnect that had happened really put me out of help's way. And so it was when I met Masami that she started introducing me to things like yoga, which I would have laughed if somebody told me to do yoga before. And then I started training with Bessel van der Kolk and learning about his yoga studies and PTSD and the connection between movement in the body and releasing stress, trauma, and grief out of ourselves. So
Mhm.
starting to move again, and then also paying attention to things like the nutrients, the nourishment that I'm giving my physical body, because I wasn't able to sleep. I was in pain all the time. I basically had just enough energy to get through my workday until I didn't. I might mention that, but it was just about all I could handle to get through a day.
Wow.
And in fact, it got so bad that I became the vice principal at the school where I was working, and my energy levels, my metabolism had become so slow that I couldn't even get out of bed in the morning. That's how much of an impact this process had had on me. And so I eventually had to leave that job because I couldn't keep going, and I felt like a complete failure because I couldn't hold it together.
Right.
And it took me a couple more years after that to take the next step, which was part of the healing process, where I actually went and did an intensive training to become a functional nutritional therapist. And that is where the light started to go off, and all these things started to click together. It's like, okay, the physiology, what we put on our body, how our body operates in relation to the events in our lives, all of these things are connected. How we see ourselves, how we present ourselves, the energy that we have to carry those things on, it is all connected.
Mm.
And so it was learning about how to actually nourish the body that all of these other analogies for nourishment started to make sense. It's like, no wonder for all of these last 20 years, I've been doing nothing but spiritual seeking, because that's what I was trying to do. I was trying to find relief. I was trying to find, diversion into something that was more than the pain that I felt, more than the sense of loss that I felt. And those things were helpful in the long run. I learned a lot of things about myself, about the world. But I would say for me, some of the really important keys were understanding that in order to take steps forward, you have to have the internal resources. And I mean at a physiological, metabolic level in order to move forward. Because that's what I was trying to do, is push through and just collapsing and collapsing and collapsing. And so that was where I really had my breakthrough. And in the about decades since then, I have continued to sustain the recovery in a new and profound way. And so, you mentioned healing before. Maybe we can jump to that unless you have something else you'd like to ask or
Yeah,
go.
well, I definitely would like to go back to, the physical effects on the body and how we can heal. Mhm.
Well, so, this is a massive topic to get in. But there are basic things about self-care that we take for granted. And I can tell you that in my role as the director of wellness that I just stepped away from, I had to tell people that were in these first responder roles the same thing, because those roles they're like an accelerated version of the general population. And what I mean by that is how those people in first responder roles experience stress and trauma and grief. It happens in such a compressed, accelerated way that it actually ages them out, burns them out, affects their body and their health and their mental health in a much, much, much faster and severe way than it does to most people. And sadly, that's been accepted as sort of a normal feature of that work. And so part of what I was trying to help them see is that they didn't have to accept that as the default. That very basic things. Okay, now this is where it gets boring and mundane. So caution to the listeners. The things that we have to do at a very basic level to take care of ourselves, and this includes how our heart is feeling, how our emotions are feeling. It's not separate from what I'm saying here. You have to make sure your body, which is the vehicle, it's the instrument that carries us forward in life, has what it needs. If you don't have that, the collapse you feel from grief is going to be so much more accentuated. And you'll feel the effects of it longer and more deeply if you don't take care of yourself. So very simple things. Are you hydrating your body enough each day? Just drinking enough water? Are you eating enough quality, nutrient-dense foods every day? Are you getting enough sleep every day? And oftentimes the answer is no to all of those things when you're in a grief or a long-term mourning process, because you don't care as much. You just lose that sense. Well, it doesn't matter as much as it used to. I don't even taste what I'm putting in my mouth. It might as well be ashes, because that's what it tastes like. The color's gone, the joy is gone. And so to be able to bring that vitality up even by a few notches is such a powerful way to give you what you need to actually complete the process of grieving, because it's like a stress cycle. It's something that the going back to my first responder example, what gets to them so much, what causes such a breakdown in their lives. And I was speaking to the executive leadership about this before I left, about how important it is to pause and to create some space in a ritual way that allows us to acknowledge what has been lost, the sacrifices that have been made, the people that have been lost, either through death or through early retirements because of health issues. This is, to me, a lot of the healing is about allowing for that space and the time. And it's during that space and time that the emotion is going to come up. And a lot of times we don't want to feel that. We're trying to stay away from that feeling. And that feeling requires energy, just like any kind of stress effect does. We have to let it play itself out, complete the cycle. And that might mean for some people a lot of crying. It might mean a lot of running or hiking or pounding pillows, whatever your method is for moving things through is up to you. But we have to allow the space and time for that to happen. Or else what happens is it gets bottled up. We move on to the next thing. It gets compounded by the next stress and the next and the next and the next. And before we know it, we start pushing into this cycle where we are physically, physiologically creating burnout conditions that are now working in the opposite direction of healing.
Right, right. Yeah. And I'm glad you bring up the point about, the nutrition and the water and all of that, because it just seems like we've talked a lot in this series about, the tools, but not really necessarily that one. And it has to be so important because you cannot function. And we know that, but like you say, when you're grieving, that's not something you really think about a lot.
And it's true that a lot of people who are grieving, because it's not always just the loss of a person, there are smaller griefs that weigh on us that if we don't see them, they're taking out of that energy bank. They're taking out of that resource bank. And I've worked with a lot of people who are suicidal. And in speaking to them, one of the questions I have to ask them is, do you still want to be here? And if the answer is yes, then it's like, okay, then we can work with that. Because that means we can take concrete steps to start rebuilding this vessel, this vehicle that you need. It's your best friend. And to start rebuilding that so you can start to see beyond this little narrow tunnel vision that has developed the more you have gone into the trench of grief and loss of capacity that comes with it.
Right.
So there are many modalities, and I'm not a psychological clinician, so that's not my bread and butter. I know a fair amount about it, but that's not what I practice. That can absolutely be helpful, and many people have been helped by that. And I would say, and as an adjunct to that, and vice versa, doing the work to sustain and support your physical being is essential. And that will, the mourning process, which comes later, which is where we get to really open into the relationship with what's been lost or who has been lost. That's ongoing. That stays with us for the rest of our life. And it brings beauty and pain at the same time. It doesn't go away, but there is sort of a blossoming that happens with it. It grows as we grow. And so, that's something I've just been telling myself, and I'll share it here, is that when we're in that stress and trauma and grieving mode, we tend to move in circles, just around and around and around. We keep covering the same old ground and seeing our own footprints. But then there's, we hear about post-traumatic growth and things like that, and the post-OS growth. And so in trauma, we move in circles, and in growth, we move in spirals. And so hopefully it's an outward spiral, not a downward spiral, but an upward outward spiral. And so we don't get there easily just on fumes. We can't write it out just with our minds. And so part of that is that transition from the grief, which to me is more of the acute, really still feeling the sting of the loss. And then there's a point where it transitions into the mourning, which is really, there's an acceptance that's happened. There's, I didn't speak at all to the stages of grief because they don't play out exactly like that for every single person. But just to be able to recognize this is a lifelong expression, this is a lifelong experience that's unfolding here, and I need to have some kind of completion with it in order to move forward. So I have to complete the cycle, and that means that I need the inner resources to make that turn happen, so that the next time I come around on it, I can actually see a little perspective and say, this has changed here, or that's changed. And even though this is absolutely not what I wanted or planned for, this is what life has given me. And there still is room to have gratitude and to feel what's still here, and to know that whatever has been lost has somehow actually still created a foundation for the life that's here now.
Yeah. And kind of makes me think about that saying, um, things happen for you, right? That there's lessons in that and things that you can learn, and actually some of those things will propel you forward. And then we talk about that whole post-traumatic growth piece. And but yeah, it's a difficult journey, and it's not, you know, I'm very new to it, but I can tell already that it's going to be a process and it's going to take a while. But that doesn't mean that there isn't joy in some days, and that we go through our periods of mourning, like you say, and we come out the other side realizing some things, and then we move on, and so on and so forth.
I often will bring in poetry into whatever I'm sharing, and I had a couple of things, but you just said something that reminded me of this quote from Khalil Gibran from his work The Prophet, and it's from the section that's on joy and sorrow. I don't have it fully memorized, so I'll paraphrase. But what he essentially says is that our sorrows are our joys unmasked. And that the deeper that the sorrows are experienced, the more that they carve out room in us to contain our joys. And that, I read that when I was in the midst of this dark place, 20 some years ago. And that's always stayed with me, how true that is, when I'm really able to face it and hold what I don't want, which is the loss. And, here's another one that's been on my mind a lot lately. It's from Joseph Campbell. And he says, you must give up the life you planned in order to have the life that is waiting for you.
Oh, yes. Mm-hmm.
And that's so hard. That is so hard to actually, it's easy to read that, but to actually live that,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and I could go on and on with poetic references here, but those kinds of things. So that to me is actually part of the healing process. In my case, is poetry.
Yeah.
Poetry, music, things that help us to connect with the feeling that's real, so that we can elicit that, live it, not get shut down and cold and hardened, but to actually continue to be warm and vibrant, even if we have had, breaks and hurt that felt so big that we didn't know if we could carry it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and one of the things that I had learned through my process here is that, before I had lost my husband, there were probably lots of moments where I actually didn't fully feel joy and didn't even realize it. Until I had gone through this and realized that there was a lot of things that needed to be released in order for me to feel joy, full joy, right? And so it's fascinating what you learn through the process of grief. It really is.
It strips you bare.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the reasons I bring up the physiology is because this is a quote from a recent study that came out from the lead author. She said, at a biological level, there's no difference between mental and physical health. And I would include in that our emotional being. And so when you're stripped down to your bare essence because of what's happened, it's the same physiologically as what happens when you're in chronic stress. And that's, we'll get to that with the gift that I have for the audience about burnout, because that's the direct link, is that when you're in that state, everything is operating on minimal survival level. And so, and not only that, but because you're so low, I mean, this is what you may have heard me say this before, but your body loves you, but it doesn't trust you all the time. That's one thing. And another one is that it's going to give you 100% of the capacity it has to give, but it might only have 40% capacity left. So it's going to give you all of that 40%. But is that enough for you to thrive? And when you're in that low energy, low capacity state, you are mostly surviving. So everything that happens in your life, even beyond the initial grief or stressor or whatever it is that you are feeling, it's all going to feel like live wires zapping you. And so that right there is, I think, one of the reasons why it's so vitally important to understand the body connection and to come back and say, you know what, I can't fix or change what's happened in the relational sphere of my life from this loss, but I can take care of this. I can take care of my body, and I can start to rebuild that, because it's taken a huge, huge blow as a result of what's happened. You know, and if I could go back right now, knowing what I know to myself at age 18 or 20 or 25 or 30, I would say, you know what, it's okay. What you're going through, it's okay. And in fact, it's completely normal for you. This is normal for you. And that's okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Beautiful. Well, maybe you could talk a little bit more about your free gift then, now that we've kind of touched on it a bit.
Yeah. So the reason I chose this is it might at first glance seem like something of a, maybe not a disconnect, but why did he choose to do this thing about signs and symptoms of burnout? Like, how does that relate to this? It relates directly. In my experience personally, and also working in the field of wellness for first responders, I have seen this pattern over and over again. And this handout that I put together on the 5 stages of burnout is actually a really helpful tool to be able to self-assess, or someone else that you may know who's going through a difficult time, whether it's from work stress or a personal loss. It really could be either. We biologically, physiologically, we all operate in more or less the same way. It just shows up in different ways and forms and degrees of severity. So these 5 stages, what is so useful as a tool here is that when you look at it, you see, first of all, that there is a very quick ramping up of symptomology the further you go into the stress cycle. So when you're in a grief process, you are in the stress cycle. You just are. You cannot not be in the stress cycle, because it's absolutely hammering everything in your being. So to start recognizing how some of these signs and symptoms reflect back to your physiology and the lack of nourishment and energy that you might be experiencing right now. That's a way that you can use to assess. Or like I said, with somebody else, you may see this in other people. And that's the feedback that I've given from sharing this information with others in the past, is that they will see this list, and they'll put themselves immediately at one of the stages. They'll say, oh, yep, that's me, stage 3 right there, or 4. The people I worked with were more 4s and 5s, but they were also populating it with everyone that they worked with and knew. And they said that was very helpful, because it showed just how much impact there was all around, and the need for recovery was high. Yeah. And so from there, we can say, I'm here, I'm low, I need help, and there are concrete ways that I can get the help. And so that's where, the work that I have done and I do with my wife now, that's what it's about, is bringing people the help and the hope that comes from within, of revitalizing your own body, your own life, your own sense of meaning, purpose, forward direction, and knowing that you have a way forward.
Wow, that would be a fantastic tool, just to be able to look at yourself, because sometimes you just look at yourself and you go, wow, you maybe don't have that scale to compare it to, right? Where am I on this? And, what do I need to be doing?
Yeah.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah. And it's not about competitive suffering or anything like that. It's not who's had it worse. It's just, how many of these symptoms am I experiencing? Because it's a very good indicator of the degree of severity and the degree of support needed. So, but the truth is, we all could benefit from some self-care and coming back and taking charge of that in our lives. Because I know grief and loss makes us feel like we're spiraling out of control a lot of the time. And so to know that we can do this thing that is going to pay us back now and in the future, and to the people around us, it will help us return to a new capacity that we didn't have before, a new one that can have a whole new expression. So that's the growth. And hopefully, like I said, it's an upward and outward spiral.
Yeah. Wow. Wonderful. Before we go, I just thought maybe I'd give you an opportunity. Is there anything you want to add to the end? Kind of a,
You
thought.
know, there, I might start throwing poetry in if you keep asking me to add more.
Yeah.
Although I do have one lined up here from John O'Donohue, who says, "May I have the courage today to live the life that I would love, to postpone my dream no longer, but do at last what I came here for, and waste my heart on fear no more."
Wow.
And that part about having the courage today to live the life that I would love, the grieving process knocks us out of that trajectory we thought we were on. And so to have that courage to step into life again, it takes courage. There's no question about that. I can tell you there were so many times I just wanted to crawl up and die and just be gone from life, be done with the pain, be done with the suffering and all the other things that came with it. So it takes courage. Just the fact that everyone is here, anyone who's listening, that means you have the courage to take it to the next day and the next day and the next day. So keep moving that foot forward and have that courage. And like John O'Donohue says, and to do what you came here for. You're still here. Even though someone you love dearly might not be here with you in the flesh, you're still here. You still carry them with you. And you don't have to waste your heart on fear that you can't continue on and have a beautiful, flourishing life. So I would just say, open that invitation for yourself to continue to live into your life, even with the loss.
Yeah, wonderful. What a great, positive, inspirational way to end this this interview. I so much appreciate you taking the time to be here today. And thanks to the audience for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.